Hello, I'm Anawultus, and today I am going to be discussing an essay that I found that was very relevant to what I am talking about lately, and that's one by Gordon H. Clark. I got a bunch of his books just today. Someone was giving them away. So one of these books, Essays on Ethics and Politics, is a sort of a compilation on various essays that Gordon Clark had written. And a particular essay that I am going to be reading today is one that was published on July 24th, 1957 in Christianity Today. It's essay number 34 in this book, Natural Law and Revelation. The 4th of July is an appropriate time to consider the basic problems of politics. In the Declaration of Independence, the American people accused the British government of abuses, usurpations, despotism, and tyranny. The king had exceeded his just powers. He had forbidden his governors to execute important laws until his assent had been obtained. He had repeatedly dissolved duly elected legislatures. He had made the judiciary dependent on his will. He had erected a harassing bureaucracy. He had made the military superior to the civil power. He had imposed taxes without the consent of the people. He had deprived them of trial by jury and transported them beyond the seas to be tried for pretended offenses. Evidently, the colonists thought that there were some things a government had no right to do. So also, when the Constitution brought into being the United States of America, a Bill of Rights had to be written into it. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, etc. The right of a people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, etc. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. Liberty today, more than ever, needs to be defended from totalitarian encroachments. Not only is there the brutality of reducing a populace to the level of abject slavery, with a controlled church to applaud its atheistic rulers, but also in Western lands the burdens and budgets and regulations and controls become constantly more onerous. The 10th article of the Bill of Rights is almost a dead letter. Can limitations on governments, can the protection of minorities from majority action, can individual rights and liberties be rationally maintained, or does democracy mean mob rule? Some of the colonists, Thomas Jefferson, for example, were deists. Jefferson regarded Jesus simply as a good moral teacher. Nonetheless, he founded individual rights on the sort of theology. After referring to the laws of nature and of nature's God, Jefferson wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. The Thomistic philosophy of a Roman Catholic Church also bases its all too totalitarian political theory on the idea of natural law. Jacques Maritain has said, there is, by the very virtue of human nature, an order or a disposition which human reason can discover. The unwritten law, or natural law, is nothing more than that. And if Maritain was not, others add that this unwritten law is the minimum religious premise because it means that the universe is not indifferent to man's individual life. Thus, the law of nature is considered superior to the statutes of a state. It is a norm for legislation, and a state is under theoretical obligation to confine its legislation within the limits prescribed by nature. In this discussion, the important point is whether or not human reason can discover in nature an order of morality that sets the norm for statutory law. Are Jefferson's unalienable rights self-evident? The argument does not center on individual rights as such, nor the existence of a creator, nor on the creator's authority to judge the nations. The point at issue is whether or not these propositions can be proven by an observation of nature. Perhaps they can be obtained only by special revelation. It is instructive to note that political theorists who were untouched by the Christian revelation almost without exception advocate totalitarianism. If Plato was a communist, Aristotle was a fascist. Private parental education is forbidden because education has at its aim the production of citizens for the good of the state. The number of children a family may have is controlled by the government. The surplus children are to be fed to the wolves, and everybody must profess the state religion. Jean-Jacques Rousseau is equally totalitarian. There is therefore a purely civil profession of faith to which the sovereign should fix the articles. If anyone, after publicly recognizing these dogmas, behaves as if he does not believe them, let him be punished by death. If individual liberties were as evident as Jefferson said, would not Rousseau have recognized them? If they could be learned by observing nature, would Aristotle have missed them? And in any case, would there not be a fairly widespread agreement on what in detail these laws are? Jefferson thought that all men are created equal. Aristotle believed that some are born to be slaves. Aquinas argued that all things to which man has a natural inclination are naturally apprehended by reason as being good. But Duns Scotus replied that this leaves no method for determining whether an inclination is natural or unnatural. David Hume and John Stuart Mill also, in their criticisms of the argument for God's existence, throw doubt on this theory. In those passages where they emphasize the injustice of the world, and Mill in particular does this vigorously, they show clearly the difficulty, or rather the impossibility, of discovering by human reason any perfect justice in nature. Although Hume and Mill are in bad repute among devout Christians, their attack on natural theology may prove to be a blessing in disguise. At least their insistence on observable injustice and misery is a recognition, however unintentional, of the existence of sin in the world. Too often, philosophers with optimistic blindness ignore or minimize sin. Now, one of the theoretical deficiencies of natural theology and natural ethics is its assumption that human reason has not been depraved or distorted by sin and remains competent and unbiased observer. An Orthodox Christian has no wish to deny that God at creation wrote the basic moral law on man's heart. Even yet, this conscience acts after a fashion. For example, experiences of guilt occur, though they may occur too infrequently. Self-commendation also occurs with greater regularity, and both are often improperly assigned. Natural political law and personal moral law can therefore be barely discerned, if at all. Thus Caesar, Napoleon, and Stalin can take pride in their crimes. Looking carefully on nature and seeing it red in tooth and claw, they can conclude that the universe is indifferent to the fate of any individual, and that it is the law of nature for the brutal to rule the meek. There are natural inclinations for domination and a will to power, and if Aquinas says otherwise, he can't see straight and reasons like a bourgeois gentilhomme. If now one turns from nature and reads special revelation, ambiguity and confusion are replaced with clearly stated principles. In such contrast to the heathen nations surrounding Israel, such a contrast as to be unintelligible to Jezebel, Ahab could not legally expropriate Naboth's vineyard. Here, for one instance, there is a divine sanction on private property, and therefore the rights of individuals, and a limitation of government. In another instance, Daniel deified the religious laws of Nebuchadnezzar, and Peter said, "We must obey God rather than men." Oh, sorry, Daniel defied. I apologize. Uh, these brief considerations indicate that the theory of natural law is not a satisfactory theoretical defense of minority and individual rights, human reason that is. Ordinarily, observations of nature leads more easily to totalitarianism than to anything else other than anarchy. But an acceptance of God's word justifies a limited government. Unfortunately, there is a theoretical justification only. It is not a civil guarantee. It does not, it actually has not prevented tyrannies in history. What is needed to protect our unalienable rights is a popular acceptance of biblical principles only insofar as a determined and vocal segment of a populace forces power-hungry politicians to curtail their ambitions, only insofar as the will of the people can reduce budgets, relax controls, and eliminate pork barrels. Only so can the 20th century trend to communism be slowed down. Long may our land be bright with freedom's holy light. Protect us by thy might, great God, our King. So I do apologize that I stumbled at times when I was reading that. I'm not accustomed to reading out loud that long lengths of text, but I will say that I found this very fascinating in the sense that it somewhat agrees with my position when it concerns my relationship to natural law. That natural law cannot be justified in itself without having something else to which it is based upon, and in fact that most individuals' perception of justice is actually incoherent with what occurs in nature. As was said, that you see in nature there's a lot of predation, animals steal from each other, and what you see is death and suffering, and such things are generally not the kinds of things that most individuals would uphold in their perception of a system of natural law. And by the understanding that their interpretation of natural law is distinct to the fact of nature, I would say that their system is therefore incoherent. Because you could say that Caesar and Napoleon and Stalin, as are mentioned in these texts, uh, while they themselves were following varying theologies, the elements of their actions uh, 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 and the elements that are not derived from their philosophies are elements that are generally natural insofar as one could say that if an action pleased them, then that is the only natural justification that they might require. Because if you would say, let's say obesity, the obesity epidemic, as some call it, obesity is caused in part by eating too much, and in part by eating the wrong things, and sometimes those two independently, sometimes both of those together. Now, what is the problem with eating the wrong things is not what one might say is a natural problem, because these things are actually things that require knowledge and understanding in order to balance your diet. Now, of course, there is a certain tendency to seek out particular foods, especially when there is a deficiency of some sort. There might be a psychological tendency for a particular food in order to balance that out, and that does occur. However, it does not occur often enough to lead for a fully balanced diet without one's knowledge of nutrition being advanced. So in that sense, without a construct, without the construct of nutritional analysis, an individual would, in a natural state, tend for a type of malnourishment. In the same way, overeating is something that might at times be caused by ignorance, but at other times is actually caused by the pleasure derived from eating, which in that sense, when that goes too far, is referred to as gluttony. And one might say that gluttony is indeed a natural property, as one might see in dogs, where in certain dogs you can give them more food than they should eat, and they will eat it, and then they will vomit, because the instinct to eat is one that is not optimized for a situation in which there is too much food. And therefore the dog suffers from eating too much and has an unhealthy consequence to that. And the same thing happens to humans. So I would say that in that sense, nature does not, in any sense, give any preference toward healthy eating. So what about sexuality? Well, rape in many ways is one thing that could be said to satisfy one's sexual desires, and something that some might even say is advantageous from a reproductive perspective. However, that does not mean that it is justified in most systems of jurisprudence. So in that sense, obeying your natural instincts and obeying your natural tendencies is actually something that is condemned by society as a large. So I would agree, as a Christian, with Gordon Clark, that these things from a Christian perspective and among Christians are things that should be determined by their understanding of Scripture and their obedience to God. However, in a secular context and in a context of living in a heterogeneous society, I believe that the state is established in order to deal with such matters, as I would say is described in the writings of John Jewell. Now, what this means for me in relation to what is written here is that from a philosophical perspective, I have to make a compromise, because I do agree with the founders of the United States, and in fact with my co-religionist, the founder of Rhode Island, that there should be a degree of religious liberty, and that the state should not be necessarily fully united with the religious magisteria, that the secular and the temporal magisteria and the religious and theological magisteria should not be united, as such leads to oppression, particularly of my own religious group in centuries past. So, let me clear my throat there, because I'm drying up a bit. I do believe that religious liberty is something that is important. However, ultimately, the question then becomes, if we are to say that morality is up to the state, are there any particular morals that we prefer? Now, as a religious individual, and when it concerns my own ideology, I have stated that there are certain values that I do hold, that rape is wrong, that murder is wrong, assault is wrong, vandalism is wrong, theft is wrong, and other things as well. And in maintaining that those things are wrong, I am essentially placing a standard that is above the state, uh, in my particular view, that is above at least the state in its constitutive elements. as I would enshrine these things in the Constitution as things that are not influenced by the day-to-day operations of the state. And therefore, I am indeed taking a partisan position towards my own particular religious values, at least when it concerns human relations, in the negative sense, in the sense of things that should not be done to other humans, non-consensual actions that are harmful to others. That is, I guess, the best way to describe these things. So, in that sense, when I envision the state, and I have the magisteria, and I have the magistrates, and I have the justiciars, or the whichever, or the archons. You can even use that term. What is above those archons is, in essence, a, a degree of values that is derived from my own religious viewpoints, that I may that although these values are by many considered universal values in the sense that they're not unique to Christianity, however, in the way I justify them for my religion. This essentially places above the supreme archon, or the president, or whatever you want to call him, above him, that places a hidden emperor, uh, that has the ultimate control on the moral justification and on the establishment of justice. And that emperor is placed above it. So it is a hidden emperor, in the sense that, due to the separation of church and state, and due to religious liberty, this individual is not explicitly invoked. However, in respect to my understanding of the universe and my paradigm, this individual is acknowledged as being an authority, and leads to my particularities for certain moral values that I hold as essential. And therefore, it is in essence ruled in the shadows by this hidden emperor. uh, and this is not a random human being. This is the God that I worship. But I say that this is in fact no different from the state that the world is in currently, from my particular theological viewpoint, in the sense that God is, in my view, already in control of the world. But when it concerns this instance, it is, rather than being de-emphasized by placing the people, or by placing a federal entity as the authoritator of these rights and of these values, it instead, in its silence, acknowledges the power and the authority of the invisible God. So that's my particular take on this. And I know that I didn't respond to exactly every point, and I will say that I'm not entirely sure about Gordon Clark's particular view of history that he expressed. I'm not entirely sure I agree with the exact interpretation of that. However, I will say that I think it's very interesting, in the sense that he is another philosopher, other than myself, who takes a similar viewpoint that the that natural laws and natural rights are not things that are self-evident, as Thomas Jefferson has called them, but rather things that have been derived. And I would say that in the application of any law and in the implementation of any justice, there is always an appeal upon a particular authority. And the authority that I and Clark as well hold is that of the Christian God. And of course, I myself in implementing this as a political philosophy and an ideology, also explicitly hold the state as an authority immediately below that. So tell me what you think. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Was this a bit too theological for you, or is there some other sense that something else that you would like to bring up? And let me just be very clear: I don't agree with every view that Gordon Clark holds. I'm not a disciple of Clark. If you have a criticism of Gordon Clark, don't uh, ask me to defend him, essentially. So anyway, thank you all for watching, and I'll be seeing you all next time on A Wiltus Over and Out.